Hey, fourth grade, Miss Rowe and Pebble here. Today we are going to be doing a guided reading and annotation of the 3 texts that you need for PARCC Practice Test 2. These are The Wild Horses of Assateague Island, The Wild Ponies of Chinataegue, and In Thunder and Rain, Chinataegue Ponies Make Annual Swim. Let's get started. So here we are on page 24 of our packet. So I'm looking at my instructions first to know what I need to be sure to pay attention to as I read. Today you will research wild horses in the United States and read 3 articles about them. As you review these sources, you will gather information about the illustrations and answer questions about wild horses so you can write an essay. This information right here is very important. I know I need to gather information about the illustrations in these 3 texts in order to answer questions and write an essay. So as I read, I'm going to pay close attention to the text feature of illustrations and think about how it provides information about the wild horses in these 3 essays. All right, let's get started with our first read. Read the passage from The Wild Horses of Assateague Island. Then answer questions 12 through 14. You can check out Mr. Friedman's videos for a guide on answering these multiple choice questions. From The Wild Horses of Assateague Island. Okay, right away we have a text feature here that we need to pay close attention to. I see the caption says, text and photographs from The Wild Horses of Assateague Island, National Park Service, U.S. Department of the Interior. Already I'm noticing that these horses are not accompanied by any humans. I see that they're on a beach next to a body of water, and I'm noticing that they're in a large group. They seem to be traveling in some sort of group. So all of this information I've already gotten just from our first text feature before we start reading. A national treasure. The wild horses of Assateague Island are descendants of domesticated animals brought to the island over 300 years ago. Horses tough enough to survive the scorching heat, abundant insects, stormy weather, and poor quality food found on this wind-swept barrier island have formed a unique wild horse society. Enjoy their beauty from a distance, and you can help make sure these extraordinary wild horses will continue to thrive on Assateague Island. My treasures do not click together or glitter. They gleam in the sun and neigh in the night. Boudoin proverb. Where did they come from? Were the horses shipwreck survivors? Local folklore describes the Assateague horses as survivors of a shipwreck off the Virginia coast. While this dramatic tale of struggle and survival is popular, there are no records yet that confirm it. Okay. Here at the top of page 25, I see another text feature that I'm going to pay close attention to get more information about these horses. I see the caption says, text and photographs from The Wild Horses of Assateague Island. Okay, so I know this photograph is from the same source as my first one. So here I'm seeing this horse. Again, I notice it's on some sort of beach. It's not accompanied by any humans. I don't see a saddle or any other indicator that it is domesticated, that it is raised by people. So this is furthering the knowledge that I have about the environment this horse lives in and its connection to people, that it is a wild horse. Or settlers' horses. During the 17th century, free-roaming horses, cows, sheep, and pigs caused expensive crop damage to local farms. Farmers were required to pay taxes on all mainland livestock and fence them in. Like people in the 21st century, these resourceful coastal residents looked for ways to avoid paying this tax. They turned to nearby Assateague Island with its abundance of food, shelter, and a natural corral made of water to solve their problem. It is likely that modern Assateague horses are descendants of those hardy animals that turned loose on the island to graze tax-free. Living the wild life in Maryland. Assateague's horses are uniquely adapted to survive on a barrier island. How do they do it? What do they eat? The horses spend most of their time grazing on an abundant but nutrient-poor salt marsh cordgrass, salt meadow hay, and beach grass. The horse's short stature is a result of hundreds of years of adaptation to this low-quality diet. Genetically, they are considered horses, even though they are now pony size. The Assateague horses drink over twice the amount of water that domesticated horses will due to their salty food supply. All that drinking, combined with a high salt diet, contributes to their bloated appearance. Where do they live throughout the year? Spring brings cool, rainy weather and fresh plant growth to the island. Many of the horses live in the marshes close to their best food sources. Foals are usually born in late spring and live with their mothers in a family group called a band. Each band is usually made up of 2 to 10 mares, their offspring, and a stallion. Hot, humid, and full of insects, summer brings a new set of challenges. The horses escape the mosquitoes and flies of the marsh by spending more time on the beach and in the surf, letting the refreshing ocean breezes carry away airborne pests. Cooler fall weather and fewer insects allow the bands to move from the beaches back to the marshes and their abundant grasses. The horses prefer to browse in shrub thickets during the damp, chilly winter season. Their thick, furry coats will protect them from ferocious winter winds and the occasional snowstorm. Do they receive veterinary care? While action may be taken to end the suffering of a gravely ill, seriously injured, or dying horse, no measures are taken to prolong the lives of Maryland's wild horses. As with other species of Assateague wildlife, horses that are sick or weak do not survive. This helps maintain a hardy, healthy population of wild horses. Virginia's horses are privately owned by the Chinatague Volunteer Fire Department and receive some veterinary care. Where can you see the wild horses? In Maryland. Maryland's horses are owned and managed by the National Park Service. They are free-roaming wildlife and could be anywhere in the park. During the summer months, many bands can be found on the beach. You will often see the horses and other wildlife by driving slowly along park roads. Protect island habitat by parking only in the designated parking areas. The life of the forest and life of the marsh trails are good places to look, especially during spring, fall, and winter seasons. Do not feed or pet the horses. Horses that learn to come up to the road are hit and killed by cars. In Virginia. Virginia's horses are privately owned by the Chinatague Volunteer Fire Department and are fenced in large enclosures. Look for the horses in the marshes along Beach Road and from the observation platform on the Woodland Trail. And there is text 1, so let's go back. And remember, we're really focusing on these text features, these illustrations. Here in this picture, we can see some evidence that we read in the text later, that the horse is grazing on, it seems like pretty low quality grass, that salty, nutrient-poor grass, and then its stomach is also bloated, which we learned was a result of their diet. If we go back to our first illustration, we can also see that these horses are relatively short in stature. They're the same size as a pony. So that supports that information that we learned later in the text as well. Here we are at text number 2 for PARCC Practice Test 2, the wild ponies of Chinatague. Again, we're going to be focusing on the visual text features in this text and how they provide us information about the ponies. Wild Ponies of Chinatague by Anika Bryn Jenkins. The last Wednesday and Thursday of every July are amazing days at Chinatague. That's pony penning time on this island just off the coast of Virginia. The ponies normally live wild on nearby Assateague Island. I'm thinking about a connection to the previous text we read. To keep the herd from getting too big, some new foals are sold each year at auction on Chinatague. To get there, the ponies are rounded up and herded across the narrow channel between the two islands. Wednesday morning, really early. My family and I woke at 4:30 in the morning to drive to Shinneteague. I was so excited I jumped out of bed. The drive from our home in Virginia Beach was just 2 hours, but it seemed like a week. After we got there, we took a small boat into the channel. The weather was wet and dreary, and I felt like an icicle as raindrops fell cold against my cheeks. But in my mind, I was dancing. All I could think was, it's almost time for the ponies to cross. First, I heard faint whinnying sounds drifting through the salty air. Then I could see the ponies on the Assateague shore. The saltwater cowboys were rounding them up. I loved the ponies at first sight. I wondered if they were thinking, what's happening? Where are we going? Okay, let's take a look at our first text feature. Here's a photograph of onlookers watching ponies swimming during roundup. So we can see in our image these ponies swimming in the water. These must be the saltwater cowboys, and then lots of onlookers watching them. So this seems to be the narrator of our text. So I'm learning a little bit more about what it looks like as these ponies swim across. Just their heads are bobbing out of the water. I can see it's a pretty large group, and I'm surprised by how many people have come to watch them. The cowboys waited a bit for the tide to change. Meanwhile, I imagined myself flying through the wind on a black and white mare. Oh, how I wished I could have a horse like that. Then, all of a sudden, I heard a shout from the crowd on the Shinneteague shore. I nearly jumped overboard with excitement. The ponies were stepping into the channel. Here's another photograph of wild Shinneteague ponies swimming the Assateague Channel. So I'm getting a better shot here in this illustration of how the horses swim with their heads just bobbing above the water, and I can imagine their hooves and their legs pushing through the water to get across the channel. Before I knew it, pony heads were bobbing in the water. The swim across the channel didn't take long, but I wish it could have lasted a lifetime. It was so beautiful that I took a photograph of it in my mind. Going to town. After the crossing, the ponies had a chance to rest. Some slept, and some of the foals suckled their mother's milk. They were getting their strength back for the next event. That would be the pony parade to the carnival grounds, where we would watch the auction. I could see a Ferris wheel and a roller coaster, but I kept going. I wanted only to see the ponies. The cowboys were herding them right down Main Street. Wow, there they are. Here's a photograph of ponies walking through town. So again, I'm surprised by how many onlookers came to see them. This must be a big event for this town. And I also see the ponies being herded through the streets. I'm noticing some similarities to the Assateague Island ponies. For example, these are much shorter than a typical horse, and I can also see a little bit of bloat in their bellies, just like we were talking about in text 1. So I'm making those connections between the two texts for how these wild horses appear. My sisters and I sloshed through the mud to get to the corral where the ponies were held for the auction. I couldn't believe it when I got to pet a brown and white foal through the fence. It felt like love itself. His coat was coarse and smelled like a salty sea breeze. I was surprised that his nose felt so soft, like velvet. I imagined him thinking, "Can I go home with you?" Later, I got to ride a tame Shinneteague pony. When I first climbed on, a shiver of excitement went down my spine. He was ready to go, and I wanted to gallop away with him. Okay, here we have another important text feature. This is a map of where the horses are going. So we see Assateague Island up here to the north and Shinneteague Island to the south. And I can see that they are both off, it's kind of difficult to see. Hopefully you can see it in your packets, both off the coast of Maryland. So that's pretty close to where we are here in Washington, D.C. Here we can see the space between Assateague Island and Shinneteague Island. So this space right here is what the horses are swimming across in this text. Day of the auction. There were so many people at the auction, I couldn't see what was happening. I had to stand on my tiptoes to get a glimpse of each foal that was brought out, but I could hear the bidding and the crowd going wild. When the price was as high as it could go, the auctioneer yelled, "Sold!" Then another foal would come out and the bidding would start all over again. After it was over, we visited Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge on Assateague Island. There were small grasses, shady trees, sandy beaches, and mosquitoes. Lots of mosquitoes. I also saw the corral where the ponies stayed before their swim. Going home. On Friday morning, the ponies that weren't sold at auction swam back across the channel. I sat on the rocks on Chincoteague shore and looked to Assateague. It's a nice, peaceful place, I thought. The ponies are lucky to be home where there's grass to graze and land to roam. In the afternoon, I got to ride again. The pony was strong and spirited, and I had to hold him back. Riding him is something I'll always remember. And how could I ever forget the gallant ponies swimming across the channel, their hearts so full of courage and wildness. Great, so this text had lots of visual features that gave us even more information. We got an idea of where these texts are taking place with Assateague Island and Chincoteague Island, as well as the channel, the water between the two. We got an idea of what these horses look like, another view, but we see them interacting with way more people than they did on the beach at Assateague Island. And we get to see a visual of what it looks like for the horses to swim across the channel with their heads bobbing above the water in both of these images. On page 40 of our packet, we're going to read our third text, In Thunder and Rain, Chincoteague Ponies Make Annual Swim by Stephanie Dazio. Again, remember we're paying close attention to our visual text features because they're going to help us when we are writing our essay. So here we see an image that looks similar to one that we saw in text 2 of the Chincoteague ponies with their heads bobbing above the water. I can imagine their legs powerfully pushing through the water underneath the water's surface, swimming across that channel. Some had arrived before dawn Wednesday, staking out the best spot where they might see the famed wild horses of Chincoteague make their swim. But a freak thunderstorm, a full moon, and a high tide threatened to derail the annual celebration and sent thousands to seek shelter. Thunder boomed and rain soaked the marshland as thousands watched about 130 ponies swim from nearby Assateague Island to Chincoteague Island. Many were forced to watch the ponies cross the channel with water pounding their backs and lightning crashing overhead. But the horses kept paddling on. Wow. Knowing that information, I'm going to go back to my image. And yes, I can see some evidence of weather. We see the rain droplets. We see it pounding against the surface of the water. That makes this even more impressive. We had no idea whatsoever about this storm, said Denise Bowden, Vice President of the Chincoteague Volunteer Fire Department. Some of the foals are auctioned off to raise money for the department. It just seemed like it came out of nowhere, she added. The annual pony swim, this year's was the 88th, is part of a week-long series of events on Chincoteague and Assateague, designed to thin out the herd of wild ponies. It culminates with the auction of the foals, about 50 this year. The event has seen rain before, but nothing like Wednesday's weather, Bowden said. She was one of the fire officials on hand, closely watching radar and encouraging people crossing a marsh to keep going. The mud will wash off, Bowden yelled into a loudspeaker. The memories will last forever. The swim has been popularized by Marguerite Henry's 1947 novel, Misty of Chincoteague, which was later made into a movie. Thousands come from across the United States and beyond. The ponies began their 5-minute crossing of the Assateague Channel about 11:30 a.m., herded toward Chincoteague Island by saltwater cowboys, volunteers, many of them firefighters. The swim takes place during slack tide, which is the period between tides when there is no current. This year, though, the ponies faced a very high tide, according to saltwater cowboy Tom Clements, who has been shepherding the ponies through the swim since the 1970s. This is as high as I've ever seen. It was a little dangerous, Clements said after the swim, noting that he wasn't sure which direction the storm was moving. No ponies were hurt, Bowden said, but a few of the cowboys' horses suffered cuts on their legs from shells. Outside of the weather, it was a perfect swim, she said. Andrea Iwanik, 39, of Silver Spring, came to the swim with her family for the first time this year. She said she arrived around 8:30 a.m. We waited 2.5 hours for torrential downpour and a little bit of pony, she said. Iwanik had hoped for a better view of the crossing, but she said she would return another year. I think we have a good story to tell, she said. Iwanik came from Maryland, but others traveled across the country for the swim and staked out their spots beginning in the early hours of the morning. Between 30,000 and 35,000 people came, Bowden said. Poppy Hendrickson Horsting, 10, convinced her family to fly from Oregon to see the swim. She's wild about horses, her dad, Leo Horsting, said, and is a big fan of Henry's book. The family flew from Oregon to Ohio, where they met up with more relatives, and drove to Virginia. Pam Richardson, 60, of Hutto, Texas, grew up reading the Misty book and has wanted to see the swim for decades. One of her husband's first gifts to her was a first edition of the book. I'd say we've been planning it for 36 years, her husband, John Richardson, laughed. My bucket list is checked off, Pam Richardson said.